March 1st, 1953. In dacha, Moscow suburbs. 6 o'clock in the evening, a light switches on inside Joseph Stalin's private bedroom. Outside the door, guard Peter Lozgachev exhales. "Thank God," he says to the man next to him. "Everything's all right." He doesn't open the door. He sits back down and waits. Inside, on the floor of the small dining room, Joseph Stalin, the most feared man on earth, the architect of the Great Terror, the man whose signature had condemned millions to camps and execution cellars, lies unconscious in his pajama bottoms and undershirt. He has been there since the early hours of the morning. He cannot speak. He cannot move. His clothes are soaked in his own urine. The light switch has triggered automatically. Stalin is not all right. And for the next 4 hours, while the guard sits outside a closed door, too terrified to enter without an excuse, the most powerful machine in the history of the 20th century waits for its operator to die. What happened in the 96 hours between Stalin's stroke and his death on March 5th, 1953, is one of the most psychologically precise documents of how totalitarian power actually works. Not the speeches, not the ideology, not the purge statistics. The moment when the system was left alone with the dying man it had been built to serve and chose to do nothing. This is that story. Before you can understand what happened at the dacha, you need to understand what the last evening of Stalin's functional life looked like. February 28, 1953. The 4 men Stalin had permitted into his inner circle were summoned as usual to the Kremlin. They watched a film together. Then they were driven to Kuntsevo, where the routine repeated itself. Dinner, wine, conversation, the performance of loyalty that had kept each of them alive through 2 decades of purges. The 4 men were Georgy Malenkov, Stalin's designated deputy, the heir apparent whose entire political identity depended on proximity to the leader; Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police, the man who controlled the archives, the prisons, the nuclear program, and the files that could destroy every other man in the room; Nikolai Bulganin, defense minister, present because Stalin needed a military representative and because Bulganin was not yet dangerous enough to fear; and Nikita Khrushchev, Moscow party boss, the jokester, the one Stalin called Mikhaida in Ukrainian when he was in a good mood, which he was that night, poking Khrushchev in the stomach with his finger as they said goodbye. At 4 o'clock in the morning, they left. Khrushchev later wrote, "He joked a lot. Stalin was in good spirits. He drank moderately. There was no sign that anything was wrong." And then, at some point in the hours after 4 a.m., alone in his dacha, Joseph Stalin walked to the dining room table, reached for a glass of mineral water, and had a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He fell to the floor. Nobody came. This detail, that nobody came, is where the real story begins, because it was not negligence in the ordinary sense. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. Stalin had built his power on a specific psychological architecture, the terror of acting without authorization. For 20 years, every person in his orbit had learned the same fundamental lesson. The cost of doing something uninstructed, anything, regardless of how sensible, could be death. The cost of doing nothing and waiting for explicit orders was survival. He had enforced this principle personally. A doctor who once told him to rest more and work less had been arrested the following week, accused of spying for British intelligence. A guard who had checked on him without being called had been replaced. The entire logic of the Soviet state under Stalin was, do not move without the signal. And so, when the morning of March 1st passed without a call from Stalin's bedroom, the guards did what 20 years of conditioning had trained them to do. They waited. Noon, no movement. 3 o'clock, nothing. 6 o'clock, the light. Thank God, everything's all right. They sat back down. At 10:30 that night, a package of official mail arrived from the Central Committee. Lozgachev finally had his excuse, a bureaucratic pretext that authorized him to knock. He entered the room and found what he later described as a terrible picture. Stalin on the floor near the table, making only a sound. Zhzh, a single noise with no consonants. Ice cold to the touch. The most powerful man in the world had been lying on the floor for somewhere between 14 and 18 hours. And now Lozgachev had to call someone. This is where the story becomes something that no formal history of the Soviet Union is equipped to explain. the spectacle of absolute power without a center. Lozgachev called Malenkov. Malenkov called Beria. Neither of them came immediately. When they finally arrived at the dacha, 4 hours after the call, Beria walked in, looked at Stalin lying on the sofa where the guards had moved him and said, "Can't you see Comrade Stalin is deeply asleep? Don't panic, get out of here and don't wake him." He ordered the guards to leave. He warned them not to call again. He then left. Why did Beria, the head of the Soviet secret police, the man who had spent 15 years executing people for insufficient loyalty, look at his unconscious superior and tell everyone to go home? There are 3 possible answers. The first is that he genuinely wasn't sure Stalin had suffered a stroke, and an unnecessary intrusion that woke the dictator would have had consequences. The second is that he was calculating, buying time, watching to see how the situation developed before committing to any response. The third is something darker, and it is the one that Khrushchev and Molotov both implied years later. Beria knew exactly what he was looking at. Whatever the answer, and the historical record will never fully resolve it, the effect was the same. After Beria's intervention, Stalin was left unattended again. The system had been given a direct instruction. The boss is sleeping. Do not disturb. Only when the guards contacted other members of the Presidium directly, going around Beria, did the machinery finally begin to move. On the morning of March 2nd, doctors arrived. But here is the detail that the official history of Stalin's death almost never leads with. The doctors who arrived that morning were not Stalin's doctors. Stalin had spent the previous year arresting his own physicians. The doctors' plot, the campaign he had launched in late 1952, accusing 9 Kremlin physicians, most of them Jewish, of murdering Soviet officials through deliberate medical negligence, had resulted in the systematic dismantling of the exact medical apparatus that existed to keep Stalin alive. His personal doctors, the specialists who had treated him for years and knew his medical history, were either in prison, under investigation, or too terrified to practice. The men who arrived at Kuntsevo that morning to treat the leader of the Soviet Union were unfamiliar with his case. They were young or old, or simply the ones who happened to be available and sufficiently politically safe to enter the room. They applied cold compresses. They administered injections. They placed leeches behind his ears. The system Stalin had designed to purge every potential threat to his person had, as a mechanical side effect, eliminated the people most capable of saving him. He had constructed his own medical vulnerability through the same instrument he used to construct everything else: fear. Now the Politburo began to arrive. And what happened in those rooms, the anterooms and corridors of the dacha while Stalin lay dying on his sofa, was the purest possible expression of what his system had produced. Khrushchev later described Beria's behavior during those hours in terms that have never been fully absorbed into the historical narrative. Beria, he wrote, moved between spewing hatred against Stalin and mocking him, and then, the moment Stalin showed any sign of consciousness, dropping immediately to his knees and kissing the dying man's hand. When Stalin lost consciousness again, Beria stood up and spat. This was not hypocrisy in any ordinary sense. It was the involuntary performance of a man whose entire nervous system had been rewired by decades of proximity to Stalin's power. The hatred was real. The terror was also real. Both operated simultaneously, reflexively, without contradiction. Beria was not acting. He simply contained 2 completely opposed emotional states that had coexisted in him for so long they no longer required any resolution. Every man in that anteroom was, to some degree, the same. Molotov was there too, according to accounts, weeping at the bedside of the man who had personally ordered the arrest of his wife, who had sat through Politburo meetings where her name was on the condemnation list and said nothing, who had written to her in the labor camp in secret. He wept. There is no recorded evidence that he felt anything other than genuine grief in that moment. 20 years inside a system that punishes dissent does not produce men capable of simple emotional honesty, even with themselves. And Stalin's son Vasily arrived, drunk, screaming at Beria and the others. "You bastards, you're killing my father." None of them answered him. Here is the political architecture that was being constructed in those anterooms, while the doctors worked and the leeches were applied, and Vasily screamed. The 4 men who most needed Stalin dead, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin, had already made one collective decision before the doctors even arrived. When the guards first called and said Stalin had collapsed, Khrushchev suggested sending Beria and Malenkov to the dacha first. He and Bulganin would follow separately. The reasoning was precise. If Stalin recovered, if he woke up, if he found men standing over him, someone would have to answer for the intrusion. Beria and Malenkov would be the ones who had been there first. They would absorb the fury. Khrushchev and Bulganin would arrive later, concerned, appropriate, having only come when the situation became serious. The succession crisis had begun before Stalin lost consciousness. The men around him were not mourning. They were positioning. On March 5, 1953, at 9:50 in the evening, Joseph Stalin died. In the hours before his death, he opened his eyes once, a single moment of apparent consciousness that every account of the final day records in detail because of what it looked like. His daughter Svetlana was present. She described it years later. He suddenly opened his eyes and looked at everyone in the room. It was a terrible gaze, mad or maybe furious, and full of the fear of death. Then he raised his left hand, the only one he could still move, and pointed it upward. Toward what? No one knew. Whether it was a gesture of threat or confusion or something unknowable happening in the mind of a man who had been condemning people with the stroke of a pen for 30 years, no one in the room could say. They watched it. They didn't move. Then he fell unconscious again, and a few hours later, he was dead. Khrushchev later reported that when the moment finally came, Beria left the room quickly, animated, almost waving. One account describes him as beaming. What happened next happened fast, because the men in that room had been waiting for a long time. Malenkov took the formal title of premier. Beria took back full control of the security apparatus, moved his forces into Moscow, and began going through the Kremlin vaults, removing files on every other member of the Presidium. The succession struggle was not an accident that emerged from Stalin's death. It had been rehearsed in the corridors of the dacha for 4 days. Every move Beria made in the hours after Stalin's body was still warm had been thought through during the hours he spent in the anteroom, watching the leeches, listening to Vasily scream. Within weeks, the doctor's plot was declared a fabrication. The arrested physicians were released. The confessions Pravda announced had been obtained through torture. An official in the security services was later executed for manufacturing the charges. This was Beria's work, not remorse, calculation. The men he released were useful to him. The institutions he dismantled were obstacles. The reforms he proposed in the spring of 1953, releasing political prisoners, decentralizing the party, even reconsidering Soviet control of East Germany, were the moves of a man who understood, better than anyone else in the room, that the Stalinism which had made him powerful had also made him a target. He needed to dismantle the machine before the machine produced the next Beria. He was right. He was also too late. In June 1953, 3 months after the funeral, Khrushchev convened a meeting of the Presidium. When Beria walked in, the same method was used that Beria himself had perfected across decades. The false pretense, the room already prepared, the decision already made. Marshal Zhukov entered through a side door with armed officers. Hands up, the most feared man in the Soviet Union. After Stalin raised his hands, he was tried in December and executed on the same day. He wept, he begged. He was the last man in the Soviet system to be surprised by its logic. On March 5, 1953, the same day Stalin died, the composer Sergei Prokofiev also died. He had been living near Red Square for years, composing at the edge of a system that had spent decades trying to control what he wrote. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage, the same medical event as the man whose shadow had shaped the last 20 years of his life. The mourning crowds for Stalin were so dense in the streets around Red Square that Prokofiev's coffin could not be moved for 3 days. Every flower in Moscow had been purchased for Stalin's funeral. The musical periodical that should have carried Prokofiev's obituary ran it on page 116. The first 115 pages were devoted to Stalin. Prokofiev's family had no flowers. They used cuttings from houseplants. When news of the composer's death reached the Bolshoi Theater, a colleague said, "Who had died? Another person besides Stalin could not have dared to die. Stalin alone had died, and all the people's grief should belong to him alone." This is what total power actually looks like when it ends, not the transition documents and the succession announcements. The city so completely organized around one man's existence that when he dies, there are no flowers left for anyone else. The 96 hours between Stalin's stroke and his death are not a story about whether he was murdered. Historians continue to debate that question, and they will continue to debate it. Molotov later claimed that Beria told him directly, "I took him out." The evidence for deliberate poisoning is real, but not conclusive. The evidence for willful medical negligence, of men who could have acted faster, called doctors earlier, authorized treatment sooner and chose not to, is documented in the testimony of every guard and attendant who was present. Whether it was poison or paralysis, or the mechanical failure of a system too frightened to function without its operator, the outcome was the same. The real question is not whether they killed him. It is what kind of system produces men who, when confronted with the dying body of the person they have served for 20 years, feel primarily relieved. Stalin built that system deliberately. He needed men who were too afraid to act. He needed the fear to be structural, not personal. Not fear of Stalin specifically, but fear of action itself, fear of the unauthorized movement, fear of the unsummoned initiative. He needed guards who would sit outside a closed door for 14 hours rather than open it, and he got exactly what he built. The same terror that kept 45,000 Soviet soldiers marching toward a nuclear cloud is the same terror that kept Peter Lozgachev sitting in a corridor waiting for a piece of Central Committee mail to authorize him to check on his unconscious employer. Systems built on total obedience do not distinguish between the orders they need people to follow and the moments they need people to think. They produce one behavior, waiting for the signal. When the signal never comes, the man dies on the floor. For 4 days after the stroke, the men who had been shaped by Stalin sat in the anterooms of his dacha, watching him breathe, positioning themselves for a world without him, and performing their grief for each other. On the evening of March 5th, when the breathing finally stopped, Beria left the room, and Khrushchev wept. The dictatorship that had terrified the planet for 25 years ended in a building full of frightened men who had been trained, above all else, never to do anything without permission. In the end, that was the only order Stalin ever gave that everyone followed perfectly. The man who constructed the most total system of political control in the modern era died because that system was too afraid to save him. Is that justice? Or is it simply the inevitable logic of what absolute power produces? Leave your response in the comments. This question has no clean answer, and that is exactly why it matters.